Welcome. Find a comfortable position, one where your body can settle deeply into rest. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Allow your jaw to soften. Take a slow breath in and release it gently. Tonight, we embark on a journey into the distant past, to a world both foreign and quietly familiar. A world of stone walls and tolling bells, of prayer and patience, of isolation and unexpected community. We will walk together through the shadowed corridors of medieval England, into places most people of that time feared to approach. We will enter the leprosarium, the leper house, and witness the strange, sorrowful, yet surprisingly complex lives of those who dwelt within. This is not a story of heroes or grand battles, but of ordinary people living through extraordinary circumstances, finding small comforts in a world that had cast them out. The history we explore tonight is real, grounded in the documentary evidence of hospital records, ecclesiastical writings, and archaeological excavations. Yet it is also a meditation, a slow consideration of suffering and survival, of human dignity persisting even when society declares you dead. Let the details wash over you. There is no need to remember every fact, every name. Simply let yourself drift alongside these long-forgotten souls, and perhaps, in understanding their world, you will find your own thoughts growing quieter, your breathing slower, your body ready for sleep. So settle in. The fire crackles softly in the hearth. The night is long and forgiving, and our story begins not with your birth, but with your death. Imagine yourself standing in the nave of a parish church in England, sometime in the year 1285. The stone walls rise around you, cold and gray, and thin shafts of autumn light filter through narrow windows high above. The air smells of damp wool, old incense, and the pressed bodies of your neighbors, people you have known all your life. But today, they stand at a careful distance from you. Their faces are turned away. Some weep quietly. Others stare at the floor. You have been examined by the local priest and by a delegation from the nearby leprosarium. They studied the pale patches on your skin, the numbness in your fingertips, the slight flattening of your nose. They asked you questions. When did you first notice the changes? Do you feel pain? Can you sense the prick of a needle against your palm? And after their consultation, conducted in hushed Latin you could not fully understand, they delivered their verdict. You have leprosy, and now you must be separated. But the separation is not merely physical. It is spiritual, legal, symbolic. Before you leave your village forever, before you pass through the gates of St. Mary Magdalene's Hospital in Winchester, or one of the dozens of other leper houses scattered across medieval England, you must first die. The priest stands before you now, his face solemn, but not unkind. He wears his ceremonial vestments, as if this were a feast day or a funeral. In truth, it is both. He begins to chant the office of the dead, assaying prayers that will be spoken over your body when you truly pass from this world. But you are standing upright, breathing, alive. The incense swirls. The words echo off the stone. Requiem aeternam dona eis, Domini. Eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord. Them, you. When the prayers conclude, the priest leads you outside to the churchyard. A shallow grave has been prepared not deep enough for burial, but deep enough for symbolism. You are instructed to stand within it, or in some accounts, to kneel. Handfuls of earth are cast upon your head, upon your shoulders. The soil is cold and smells of clay and old roots. You are being buried alive, in ceremony if not in fact. Your old life ends here. Your name will be struck from certain records. Your property, if you had any, will pass to your family or to the church. You are, in the eyes of the law and society, a ghost. And yet you continue to breathe. The journey to the leprosarium is a quiet one. You are given a crude clapper, or a small bell, and instructed to sound it if anyone approaches on the road. The noise is sharp, intrusive, a warning. Stay back, unclean. The medieval world believed that leprosy could spread through breath, through proximity, through the very air surrounding your body. Medical understanding was limited, shaped by the ancient Greek theory of humors, by biblical accounts of affliction and divine punishment, by fear that curdled into superstition. So you walk alone, or perhaps with one or two others similarly afflicted, along the rutted tracks that lead away from your village. The bell rings with each step. Birds scatter from the hedgerows. A farmer pauses in his field, sees you, and makes the sign of the cross. You are a living reminder of mortality, of the fragility of flesh, of how quickly God's favor can turn. The leprosarium, when you finally reach it, is not as terrible as you feared. St. Mary Magdalene in Winchester, established in the early 12th century, sits just outside the city walls on a slight rise of ground. It is built of gray stone, modest but solid, arranged around a central courtyard. There is a chapel, a hall, dormitories, a garden, a small cemetery. Smoke rises from a cookhouse. You can hear the murmur of voices, the clang of a pot, the rustle of wind through vegetable plots. A brother of the house, himself a leper, though his symptoms are less advanced, and some greets you at the gate. His voice is calm, almost gentle. He has seen many arrive as you do now, hollow-eyed and afraid, still adjusting to the idea that this place will be their home until death. He leads you inside, shows you where you will sleep, explains the rhythm of the days to come. You are given a rough woolen habit, a cloak, sturdy shoes. You are assigned a place in the dormitory, a long room with narrow beds arranged along the walls, each with a straw mattress, a thin blanket, perhaps a wooden chest for personal belongings. The space is spare, but not squalid. Light enters through small windows. The floor is swept. There is a sense, fragile but present, of order. Life in a medieval leprosarium revolves around prayer. The bells of the chapel mark the hours matins before dawn. Prime at sunrise, terce, sext, none, vespers as the light fails, compline before sleep. You are not a monk, not bound by monastic vows, but the structure of your day mirrors that of a monastery. Prayer offers comfort, routine, a framework to contain the slow unraveling of your body. You rise in the darkness before dawn, when the air is coldest and your joints ache with a deep, persistent stiffness. The dormitory is never entirely silent. Someone coughs, another shifts on their creaking bed, a third murmurs in restless sleep. You pull your cloak around your shoulders and make your way to the chapel, moving carefully. Your feet, though you wear shoes, have begun to lose sensation. You must watch where you step, lest you stumble or injure yourself without realizing. The chapel is small, lit by candles that cast wavering shadows on the walls. The priest, who comes from the city to say Mass, keeps his distance, but he performs the sacraments with dignity. The Eucharist is offered, though sometimes on a long spoon, the wine poured carefully so no lips touch the chalice. These precautions wound, but you are grateful nonetheless to remain within the fold of the church, to be counted, however tenuously, among the faithful. After the morning service, there is a simple breakfast bread, weak ale, perhaps a piece of cheese. The bread is dense and dark, made from rye or barley, filling if not flavorful. You eat slowly, partly from habit, partly because your hands have begun to claw slightly, the fingers curling inward as the disease attacks the nerves. You have learned to grip a cup between both palms, to tear bread with whatever dexterity remains. Then comes work. The leprosarium survives partly on charitable donations, a steady trickle of coin, food, and firewood from pious benefactors who believe that aiding lepers accrues spiritual merit, but it also relies on the labor of its residents. Those who are able tend the gardens, coaxing turnips, cabbages, onions, leeks, and herbs from the soil. The garden is extensive, nearly an acre, and it requires constant attention, planting, weeding, watering, harvesting. The work is slow and repetitive, but it grounds you in the present moment. The smell of turned earth and crushed time, the satisfying tug of a weed pulled free. Others work in the kitchen, preparing the communal meals. The diet at St. Mary Magdalene is surprisingly decent, shaped by the medieval medical belief that certain foods could help balance the humors and slow the progression of leprosy. Fish is served regularly: dried cod, salted herring, sometimes fresh pike or perch from nearby rivers. Poultry appears often: roasted or stewed chicken, goose, duck. These were considered moist and temperate foods, thought to counter the excess of black bile believed to cause leprosy. You eat better here, in some ways, than you did as a peasant laborer. The meals are plain but regular. There is enough. No one goes truly hungry. This is a strange mercy, a paradox of your new life cast out, declared dead, yet fed with a care you rarely experienced before. But comfort cannot halt the slow, relentless march of the disease. Leprosy, what we now know as Hansen's disease, caused by the bacterium Mycobacterium leprae, attacks the peripheral nerves, the skin, the mucous membranes. In the medieval period, diagnosis was imprecise. Many conditions were called leprosy, true leprosy, certainly, but also psoriasis, eczema, lupus, even advanced syphilis in later centuries. The leprosaria held a mix of sufferers, some with a genuine bacterial infection, others with ailments that merely resembled it. For those with true leprosy, the changes are gradual but unmistakable. The disease begins with pale or reddish patches on the skin, areas where sensation dulls and then vanishes entirely. You learn to check your hands and feet daily for injuries you cannot feel: cuts, burns, blisters. Without pain to warn you, wounds fester unnoticed. Infection sets in. Fingers and toes, already numb, begin to shorten as repeated trauma and infection cause the body to reabsorb bone. Your face changes. The disease attacks the cartilage of the nose, causing it to flatten and collapse inward. Your eyebrows thin and disappear. Nodules rise on your skin, particularly on your forehead, cheeks, and ears, giving your features a coarsened, thickened appearance. Your voice grows hoarse as lesions form in your throat. When you speak, it comes out rough and strained, another marker of your condition. The medieval mind struggled to understand these transformations. Physicians trained in the universities of Salerno or Montpellier consulted the works of Galen and Avicenna, attributing leprosy to an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Leprosy, they concluded, arose from an excess of black bile, the humor associated with melancholy, dryness, cold, and earth. Treatments focused on restoring balanced dietary changes, herbal remedies, bloodletting, purgatives. None of these worked, of course, though they provided the comfort of action, the illusion of control. Religious interpretations layered atop the medical. Leprosy appeared in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, where it was often a sign of divine displeasure or a test of faith. The figure of Job, covered in sores yet faithful, offered a model of patient suffering. Christ himself had touched lepers, healing them, demonstrating compassion for the outcast. Medieval Christians were thus caught between fear and pity, between the impulse to isolate and the command to care. You feel this tension in how people look at you, or rather, how they look away. On the rare occasions when you leave the leprosarium grounds, ringing your bell as you walk to the edge of town to receive alms or to attend a special mass, you see it in their eyes. Horror, yes, disgust, but also something softer: guilt, perhaps, or sorrow. Some press coins into your clawed hands. Others mutter prayers as they pass. A few spit or make warding gestures. You learn not to expect consistency from the world beyond the walls. And so, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the leper house becomes your world. The faces of your fellow residents grow familiar, more familiar, perhaps, than your own family's faces, now fading into memory. There is John, a former carpenter whose hands have curled into useless fists, but who still offers advice on mending furniture. There is Agnes, who sings softly while she works in the garden, old hymns half remembered from childhood. There is Thomas, a former merchant, who tells stories of his travels to London and beyond, embellishing them with each retelling until you are not sure what is memory and what is wish. You talk in the evenings after supper, sitting in the hall or in the courtyard when the weather is mild. The conversations meander complaints about aching joints, speculation about whether the harvest will be good, gossip about the master of the hospital or the priest. Small talk, mundane talk, the kind of idle chatter that fills any community. It is ordinary, and that ordinariness is a kind of gift. There are moments of levity, even humor. Someone makes a joke about their missing fingers, and the room erupts in laughter, dark laughter, edged with pain, but genuine nonetheless. Laughter that says, we are still here, still human, still capable of joy, even in this diminished state. These moments are rare and precious, small rebellions against despair. There are also moments of deep sorrow. You wake one morning to find that the woman who slept 3 beds down from you has died in the night. Her body is carried to the cemetery, wrapped in a simple shroud and buried with quiet prayers. Death is common here, a constant companion. Some succumb to leprosy itself, their bodies finally giving out after years of slow decline. Others die of secondary infections, of pneumonia, of ailments unrelated to their primary diagnosis. The cemetery grows, row by row, year by year. Yet even in death, there is a strange comfort. You will not die alone. You will not be abandoned in a ditch or left to rot in a hovel. When your time comes, there will be others to wash your body, to pray over you, to lay you in the ground. In a world that declared you dead while you still lived, this final care is no small thing. The leprosarium survives on charity, and charity is a complex, double-edged thing. Wealthy patrons endow the hospital with land, coin, or goods, motivated by a mix of genuine compassion and calculated self-interest. Caring for lepers was considered a particularly meritorious act, one that might reduce time in purgatory or demonstrate piety to one's neighbors. Kings and queens, bishops and nobles, prosperous merchants all, contributed to the leprosaria scattered across England and Europe. St. Mary Magdalene in Winchester, like many such institutions, held lands that generated income fields rented to farmers, mills that ground grain for a fee, orchards that produced fruit. This income, combined with direct donations, supported the residents and paid the modest salaries of the staff, the master who oversaw the institution, the chaplain who said Mass, the servants who hauled water and firewood. You are both the object of charity and, in a sense, its vessel. By existing, by suffering visibly, you provide an opportunity for the wealthy to demonstrate virtue. It is an uncomfortable position, one that strips you of agency and dignity, even as it provides food and shelter. You learn to bow your head when a benefactor visits, to murmur thanks, to perform the role of the grateful, pious leper. It is a kind of labor, this performance, as exhausting in its way as tending the garden. But the charity is real, even if its motivations are mixed. The meals arrive, the roof is repaired, firewood is stacked for winter. You do not freeze, you do not starve. Compared to the fate of many lepers who have no access to a hospital, who wander the roads begging and sleeping rough, your situation is almost enviable. Almost. Time moves differently in the leprosarium. The seasons turn spring with its muddy thaw and budding gardens, summer with long light and the hum of bees, autumn with its harvest and chill winds, winter with its short gray days and a constant battle against cold. The rhythm is agricultural, liturgical, eternal. One year bleeds into the next. You measure time not by years, but by losses. The year Agnes died. The year your left hand finally became too weak to grip a spade. The year the new master arrived, stricter than the last. The year's snow fell so heavily that the road was impassable for a week, and supplies ran low, and you ate thin gruel twice a day until the thaw. Your body continues its slow betrayal. More sensation fades, more fingers curl. Your face in the polished metal mirror, glimpsed rarely, for mirrors are scarce, looks increasingly alien. You avoid your reflection. It is easier to live in the present, in the immediate sensations that remain: the warmth of sun on your face, the taste of bread, the sound of the chapel bell, the murmur of voices in the dormitory at night. There are compensations, small and fleeting. The garden in June, riotous with green. A particularly fine meal on a feast day: roasted goose, honeyed parsnips, fresh bread. A kind word from the chaplain. A letter read aloud from a family member who has not entirely forgotten you. These moments do not erase the suffering, but they punctuate it, create texture, prevent the days from collapsing into an undifferentiated gray blur. You learn patience because you have no choice. You learn to find meaning in ritual, in repetition, in the small tasks that structure each day. You learn, perhaps, a kind of acceptance, not of the disease, never that, but of your life as it now is. You learn to live within the narrow confines of the leprosarium, to extract what comfort and community you can from this place that is both prison and sanctuary. But the psychological burden is immense, a weight that never fully lifts. You are alive, but the world treats you as dead. Your name may still be whispered in your village, but it is spoken in the past tense. Remember when he ... quotes, "She used to ... You are a cautionary tale, a tragic figure, a lesson in the fragility of fortune. You are forbidden from certain spaces: market squares, taverns, most churches. You cannot marry. You cannot own property. You cannot testify in court. The bells and clappers you carry ensure that no one forgets your status, that no one accidentally touches you or breathes the air too near your face. You are marked, always and forever, as unclean. This separation is perhaps the cruelest aspect of the disease. Not the physical pain: much of leprosy is painless, the numbness a mercy of sorts. Not even the disfigurement, though that is hard, but the loneliness, the knowledge that you will never again embrace a child, kiss a lover, shake a friend's hand in greeting. The knowledge that you will die in this place, and your grave will be marked, if at all, with a simple wooden cross that will rot and fall within a decade. Some residents sink into despair. They stop eating, stop working, stop speaking. They lie on their beds and wait for death. The community tries to rouse them, but sometimes the weight is too much. Sometimes the grief wins. Others find solace in faith. They pray with fierce intensity, believing that their suffering has meaning, that God is testing them, that in the next life they will be whole and welcomed into heaven. They wear their affliction as a kind of spiritual badge, a sign that they have been chosen to bear a heavy cross. This interpretation requires a certain mental alchemy, a transformation of agony into virtue, but for those who can manage it, it offers a lifeline. And some simply endure, day by day, without grand theological frameworks or dramatic despair. They endure. They wake, they eat, they work, they sleep. They do this until they cannot, and then they die. There is a quiet heroism in this, a stubborn refusal to surrender to obliteration. And yet, against all expectations, there is stability here. The leprosarium is cruel in its way, but it is also predictable. There are no sudden evictions, no famines that force you to the road, no wars that conscript you into service. The walls that confine you also protect you. The rules that restrict you also sustain you. For many medieval peasants, life was a constant scramble working fields you did not own, at the mercy of weather, landlords, and disease. One bad harvest could mean starvation. One injury could mean destitution. The ledger of survival was always balanced on a knife's edge. Here, in the leper house, that precariousness is removed. You will eat, however, plain the fare. You will sleep under a roof, however cold the room. You will not be cast out so long as you follow the rules, attend the services, do your share of work when able. There is a grim security in this, a foundation beneath your feet even as your body crumbles. You would trade it all, of course, for health, for freedom, for the life you lost. But that is not on offer. What is on offer is this: a bed, a meal, a community of fellow sufferers, a plot of ground where your bones will rest. In the harsh arithmetic of the medieval world, it is not nothing. The night deepens around the leprosarium. In the dormitory, you lie on your narrow bed, listening to the familiar sounds, the rustle of straw mattresses, the soft snoring, the occasional moan of someone shifting in their sleep. Outside, wind moves through the garden, rattling the bare branches of winter or stirring the heavy leaves of summer. The chapel bell tolls Compline, the last service of the day, calling the hour of rest. You close your eyes. Your body aches, as it always does. Your hands, curled beneath the blanket, throb faintly. But you are warm enough. You are fed. You are, in the only sense that now matters, home. And in the slow, measured rhythm of your breathing, in the gradual softening of your thoughts, sleep begins to arrive, gentle, merciful, inevitable. We leave behind, for a time, the quiet stone walls of the leprosarium and turn our attention eastward, toward the sun-baked lands of the Levant. The year is 1187, 2 years before our Third Crusade truly begins. Jerusalem, the holy city, center of Christian pilgrimage for nearly a century, has fallen. Saladin Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, had united the fractured Muslim territories and turned his considerable military skill toward reclaiming what had been lost. His army surrounded Jerusalem in September of that year. The siege was brief. The city's defenders, outnumbered and exhausted from earlier defeats, negotiated surrender. On October 2nd, Saladin entered Jerusalem. Unlike the Crusaders who had taken the city in 1099, drowning its streets in indiscriminate slaughter, Saladin chose restraint. Ransom was offered. Most inhabitants were allowed to leave, though many were enslaved when they could not pay. The news rippled across Christendom like a stone cast into still water. Jerusalem lost. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, site of Christ's burial and resurrection, in Muslim hands. Pope Gregory VIII issued a call to arms. Kings and nobles felt the weight of obligation, the sting of shame, the pull of pious duty mingled with political ambition. 3 great monarchs took up the cross: Frederick Barbarossa, the aged Holy Roman Emperor; Philip II of France, politically astute and cautious; and Richard I of England, warrior king, newly crowned, restless and ambitious. Frederick would drown in a river in Anatolia before reaching the Holy Land, his army fragmenting in grief and confusion. Philip and Richard would make it further, but their alliance was fragile, built on mutual distrust and competing interests. Imagine the preparation, a gathering of men, arms, ships, provisions. Imagine the slow assembling of an army in the ports of France and England, the marshalling of knights and foot soldiers, the blessing of banners, the tearful farewells. Crusades moved at the pace of wind and oar, of marching feet and laden carts. Months stretched between decision and arrival. Richard did not reach the Holy Land until June of 1191. By then, the city of Acre, on the northern coast of what is now Israel, had been under siege for nearly 2 years. Guy of Lusignan, the deposed king of Jerusalem, had begun the siege in August 1189 with a modest force, perhaps 7,000 men, including 400 knights. It was an audacious gamble, a crusader army besieging a fortified city while Saladin's relief force surrounded them in turn. The crusaders were themselves besieged, caught between Acre's walls and Saladin's encampments, supplied only by ships that braved the Mediterranean. The siege ground on through seasons. Men died of disease, of wounds, of hunger. Reinforcements trickled in Danes, Frisians, Flemings, French contingents under Count Henry of Champagne. Philip of France arrived in April 1191. Richard came in June, his fleet glittering on the horizon, bringing fresh troops, siege engines, gold, and most importantly, energy. Richard's arrival shifted the balance. He was 33 years old, tall, red-haired, physically robust, and utterly focused on the capture of Acre. He brought mangonels and trebuchets, stone-throwing engines that battered the city walls day after day. The rhythm of the siege became almost hypnotic. The creak of ropes, the thud of counterweights, the crash of stone against stone, the occasional scream as a projectile found its mark. Inside Acre, the Muslim garrison held firm, but their position was untenable. Supplies dwindled. The walls cracked. Saladin launched attacks against the Crusader camp, trying to relieve the pressure, but the Christians held their lines. In early July, the garrison negotiated terms. They would surrender the city, hand over prisoners, pay ransom, return the true cross, a relic of profound symbolic importance. On July 12, 1191, the banners of the Crusader kings rose over Acre's walls. It was a victory, hard-won and costly, but a victory nonetheless. What followed casts a long shadow over Richard's reputation. The terms of surrender required Saladin to meet certain conditions within a specified time-frame: delivery of prisoners, payment of gold, return of the true cross. Negotiations dragged. Misunderstandings accumulated. Richard grew impatient. He suspected delays, perhaps outright refusal. On August 20th, 1191, Richard ordered the execution of the Muslim prisoners taken at Acre, between 2,700 and 3,000 men. They were marched outside the city walls, within sight of Saladin's camp, and put to death. The sources do not agree on the precise method. Some speak of swords, others of mass beheadings, but the outcome was unambiguous. Thousands of lives ended that afternoon, a calculated act meant to send a message, to free Richard's forces from the burden of guarding so many captives, to punish Saladin for perceived failures. It was not unusual for the era. Medieval warfare operated by different rules, with a wholesale killing of prisoners, particularly when terms were disputed, was within the grim logic of the time. But it was also a moment where the ideals of chivalry, much celebrated in songs and stories, collided brutally with the realities of campaign strategy. Saladin, witnessing from a distance, reportedly retaliated by executing Christian prisoners in his possession. Violence begat violence, as it so often does. Philip of France, meanwhile, had grown ill and weary of the campaign. He departed for home in early August, leaving his forces under the nominal command of the Duke of Burgundy. Richard became the unchallenged leader of the crusade, a role he seemed born to occupy. Richard's strategic goal was Jerusalem, but the direct route from Acre led through inhospitable terrain. He chose instead to march south along the coast, securing port cities to maintain supply lines, aiming first for Jaffa and turning inland toward the Holy City. The march began on August 22, 1191, just 2 days after the massacre. It was a slow, grinding advance. The Crusader army, perhaps 10,000 to 12,000 strong, moved in disciplined columns. Infantry marched nearest the sea, where the fleet shadowed them, delivering water and provisions. Cavalry rode on the inland flank, presenting a shield of horseflesh and mail against Saladin's mounted archers. The sun beat down mercilessly. The coastal plain shimmered with heat. Men wore heavy armor mail hauberks, padded gambesons, helms of iron designed for European climates, insufferable under the Levantine sun. They marched in the early morning and late afternoon when possible, resting during the worst of the midday heat. Thirst was constant. Dust coated their throats. The sea, so close, offered no relief. Salt water, endless and taunting. Saladin harried them. His mounted archers, light and fast, rode close, loosed volleys of arrows, and wheeled away before the Crusader cavalry could respond. It was a war of attrition, of patience, of nerves. Richard ordered his men not to break formation, not to chase the enemy, to endure the arrows and keep marching. Discipline held, barely. Horses fell. Men were wounded. The column pressed on. On September 7th, 1191, near the coastal town of Arsuf, Saladin committed to a major engagement. His forces, numbering perhaps 25,000 to 30,000, pressed hard against the Crusader column. The attack was fierce, focused particularly on the rearguard, where the Hospitallers' warrior monks, much like the Templars, struggled, under relentless archery and cavalry charges. Richard had ordered his men to hold formation, to wait for his signal before counterattacking. But the pressure mounted. Horses screamed. Men fell. The Hospitallers, bloodied and desperate, began to charge without orders. The line wavered. Richard saw that his carefully maintained discipline was about to shatter. In a moment of tactical clarity, he turned potential disaster into opportunity. He sounded the charge. The Crusader heavy cavalry, held in check for hours, surged forward. The impact was devastating. Saladin's forces, skilled in skirmishing and maneuver, found themselves unable to withstand the concentrated shock of armored knights in full gallop. The Muslim lines buckled, broke, and retreated. The battle was not a rout. Saladin's men withdrew in reasonable order, rallying repeatedly, contesting the field until sunset, but it was a clear Crusader victory. Richard's reputation as a military commander solidified that day. He had kept his army intact under terrible pressure, turned a near collapse into a decisive charge, and driven the Sultan's forces from the field. The march continued. Jaffa was taken. The Crusaders paused, regrouped, tended their wounded. Autumn turned toward winter. The next phase, Jerusalem, loomed in their thoughts like a distant mirage. The first attempt began in late 1191. The army moved inland, climbing from the coastal plain into the Judean hills. The landscape changed: olive groves, rocky slopes, thin soil. The weather turned cold and wet. Winter rains lashed the columns. Mud clogged the roads. Supplies stretched thin, despite the fleet's best efforts to keep the army fed. Richard reached Beit Nuba, a mere 12 miles from Jerusalem, in early January 1192. From the higher ground, scouts could see the city's walls. But Richard hesitated. His advisors, the military orders, the experienced Frankish barons who had lived in the Holy Land for years, counseled caution. Jerusalem, they argued, could not be held even if taken. It was too far from the coast, too difficult to supply, too exposed to counterattack. Even if they breached the walls, they would be besieged in turn by Saladin's forces. Richard listened. He withdrew. The decision was strategically sound, but it must have cost him dearly. To come so close, to see the goal, and then to turn away, it was a bitter draught. The winter passed in skirmishing, in raiding, in diplomatic maneuvering. Richard fortified Ashkelon, a strategic port at the southern edge of Crusader territory, rebuilding walls that Saladin had razed. In May 1192, the Crusaders captured Derham, a fortified town near the Egyptian frontier, after 5 days of fierce fighting. These were solid gains, shoring up the Crusader state's defenses, but they were not Jerusalem. In June, Richard tried again. The army marched inland, retracing their earlier path, reaching Beit Nuba once more. Once more, the same arguments were made. Once more, Richard faced the reality that Jerusalem, even if taken, would be a trap. He withdrew a second time. Richard fell ill in the summer of 1192. The sources are vague about the nature of the illness. Perhaps a fever, perhaps dysentery, perhaps sheer exhaustion, compounded by the relentless campaigning, the climate, the weight of leadership. He recovered, But the illness underscored his mortality, the limits of even his considerable strength. The crusade was faltering. Men wanted to go home. 3 years is a long time to be far from one's lands, one's family, one's normal life. Knights worried about their estates, about rivals seizing opportunities in their absence. The French contingent, without Philip to lead them, grew restless. Even Richard, who had poured so much of his formidable will into this campaign, began to recognize that the crusade could not achieve its ultimate goal. Throughout the campaign, even during the fiercest fighting, there had been communication between Richard and Saladin. Emissaries traveled back and forth, proposing terms, exploring possibilities, testing the waters for a negotiated settlement. The two men never met face to face, despite later legends to the contrary, but they developed a kind of mutual respect, a recognition of each other's abilities. Saladin, too, was exhausted. His empire was vast, but fragile, held together by his personal authority. Prolonged warfare strained resources and tested loyalties. He was in his 50s, no longer young, and perhaps he also felt the weight of years, the desire for rest. The negotiations, conducted largely through intermediaries, gradually shaped an agreement. Richard would not take Jerusalem. Saladin would allow Christian pilgrims free access to the holy sites within the city. The coastal territories Jaffa, Acre, and the lands between would remain in Crusader hands, giving the Kingdom of Jerusalem a viable, defensible territory, even without its namesake city. On September 2nd, 1192, the treaty was finalized. The war, in practical terms, ended not with the dramatic recapture of Jerusalem, but with a negotiated compromise. The Crusader states survived, smaller but stabilized. Pilgrims could visit the holy sites. Saladin retained Jerusalem, but he had not destroyed the Frankish presence in the Levant. It was, by the standards of the time, a reasonable outcome. Neither side achieved total victory, neither suffered total defeat, yet it felt incomplete. Richard had come so far, fought so hard, spent so much English gold, and Jerusalem remained beyond his reach. The heroic narrative demanded a triumphant entry into the holy city, the banners of Christendom flying from the dome of the rock. Reality offered instead a treaty signed in a coastal fortress, guaranteeing access but not possession. Richard departed the Holy Land on October 9, 1192. He left behind a functioning Crusader kingdom, strengthened fortifications, and a reputation for military brilliance tempered by strategic pragmatism. He also left thousands of gravesmen who had died of disease, of wounds, of the slow attrition of a 3-year campaign in a foreign land. Richard's journey home became its own ordeal. He sailed west, aiming to return quickly to England, where his brother John was maneuvering for power, and Philip of France was encroaching on Richard's continental territories. But storms drove his ship off course. He was forced to travel overland through Central Europe, passing through lands controlled by Duke Leopold of Austria, whom Richard had offended during the siege of Acre. Leopold captured Richard in December 1192 near Vienna. A king of England, one of the most powerful men in Christendom, was imprisoned. Leopold eventually handed Richard over to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI, who demanded an enormous ransom, 150,000 marks, an almost unimaginable sum. England was taxed heavily to raise the money. Churches surrendered their silver. Barons contributed. The Cistercian order gave up a year's wool production. It took over a year to gather the ransom. Richard was finally released in February 1194, having spent more than a year in captivity. He returned to a kingdom strained by his absence and the financial burden of his ransom. He would spend the remaining years of his life, until his death from a crossbow wound in 1199, fighting to reclaim and secure his French territories. The crusade, the great adventure, the defining campaign of his reign, faded into memory. Richard the Lionheart became a legend. Songs and stories celebrated his prowess, his courage, his nobility. He appeared in ballads as the ideal Christian knight, the brave king who ventured to the Holy Land to reclaim Jerusalem. The reality, as with all legends, was more complicated. He was a brilliant tactician, capable of inspiring loyalty and maintaining discipline under terrible conditions. He was also capable of cold brutality, as the prisoners at Acre discovered. He was driven by a mix of genuine piety, political ambition, and personal restlessness. He spent most of his reign outside England, viewing his kingdom primarily as a source of revenue for his continental and crusading ambitions. Saladin, too, became a legend in both Muslim and Christian traditions, a model of chivalric behavior, merciful and wise, a worthy adversary. He was also a ruthless conqueror, a pragmatic politician, and a man capable of executing prisoners when it suited his purposes. The Third Crusade, in retrospect, changed little in the long term. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands until the Sixth Crusade briefly reclaimed it in 1229, and then lost it again in 1244. The Crusader states lingered on the Levantine coast for another century before finally collapsing. The enormous expenditure of blood, treasure, and effort produced, in the end, a temporary stalemate. Yet the crusade shaped the men who fought it, the kingdoms that financed it, and the stories told about it for centuries afterward. It was one of history's great might-have-beens. Richard, standing 12 miles from Jerusalem, close enough to see the walls, turning away because the cost of taking the city would be too high. Imagine the soldiers who survived, who returned to France or England or Germany after 3 years in the East. They carried memories of the searing heat, the taste of dust, the weight of mail under the sun. They remembered the friends who had died of fever in the camps outside Acre, who had fallen at Arsuf, who had succumbed to dysentery or infected wounds or simple exhaustion. They told stories, embellishing over time, shaping their experiences into narratives that made sense, that gave meaning to the suffering and loss. They became the old men in taverns, recounting the time they fought alongside the Lionheart, the time they saw Saladin's banners on the horizon, the time they almost reached Jerusalem. And in the leprosaria scattered across Europe, some of the residents were returned crusaders, men who had contracted leprosy, or what was thought to be leprosy, during their time in the East. The disease was endemic in the Levant, and medieval medicine conflated many conditions under the label of leprosy. These men had gone seeking glory and returned marked, exiled, condemned to live out their days behind the walls of the leper house. The crusade, a bitter memory. The night deepens. The story of Richard and Saladin, of the Third Crusade, of armies marching across deserts toward an elusive goal, begins to fade. It was a grand affair, full of sound and movement, of clashing armies and diplomatic maneuvering. But even grand affairs, when viewed from sufficient distance, lose their sharp edges. They become, like all history, a collection of details, some remembered, most forgotten shapes, moving through time. Let them recede now, those armored figures, those banners rippling in the hot wind. Let the story settle like dust after a long march. Rest a while. There is more to come, but it can wait. Everything can wait. The past is patient. We return now from the dust and heat of the Crusades to quieter contemplations. We turn our attention inward, not to the body itself, but to how the medieval mind understood the body, its workings, its vulnerabilities, its mysterious transformations from health to illness. This is a story of a medical system that seems strange to us now, yet possessed its own internal logic, its own careful observations, its own attempts to make sense of suffering. The foundation of medieval medicine was humoral theory, inherited from the ancient Greeks and refined over centuries by physicians in the Islamic world and Christian Europe. At its heart was a simple, elegant idea. The human body contained 4 fundamental fluids, 4 humors, and health depended upon their balance. These 4 humors were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each was associated with specific qualities drawn from the classical elements. Blood was hot and moist, linked to air and the season of spring. Phlegm was cold and moist, associated with water and winter. Yellow bile, also called choler, was hot and dry, connected to fire in summer. Black bile melancholy was cold and dry, linked to earth and autumn. Picture these humors not as abstract concepts, but as real substances flowing through the body, produced primarily in the stomach through the heat of digestion. Medieval physicians believed they could observe these fluids directly in certain circumstances. Blood, obviously, when it flowed from a wound. Phlegm in the mucus coughed up during illness. Yellow bile in vomit. Black bile in particularly dark evacuations, or in the appearance of certain skin conditions. The humors were in constant flux, responding to diet, climate, activity, emotion, age, and countless other factors. A healthy person possessed all four humors in harmonious proportion, each tempering the others, creating a stable equilibrium. Illness arose when this balance tilted, when one humor became excessive or deficient, or when a humor became corrupted, turning thick or thin, hot or cold beyond its proper nature. This was not superstition in the minds of medieval practitioners. It was science, built on centuries of observation and theoretical refinement. It offered a comprehensive explanation for the bewildering variety of human ailments, a framework that connected the microcosm of the body to the macrocosm of the natural world, the seasons, the stars, the divine order itself. Within this humoral framework, leprosy occupied a particularly fearsome place. The disease manifested in so many ways: skin lesions, numbness, disfigurement, weakening of limbs, and progressed so slowly that it seemed to reveal some fundamental corruption deep within the body's essential fluids. Medieval physicians approached the diagnosis of leprosy with remarkable care and rigor. The stakes were immense. A positive diagnosis meant social death, permanent exile, the end of family life. Medical texts from the period, such as Gilbert the Englishman's Compendium Medicinae, written around 1230, or Jordan of Turis, The Symptoms of Lepers from 1330, describe elaborate diagnostic procedures designed to distinguish leprosy from other skin conditions. Imagine yourself being examined. The physician, or more often, a panel of physicians and clergy, studies your skin closely, looking for specific signs. Are there pale patches with diminished sensation? Are there raised nodules on the face, particularly the forehead and cheeks? Has the nose begun to flatten? They prick your skin with needles, testing for areas of numbness. They examine your urine, holding a flask of it up to the light, observing its color, clarity, and sediment. They take your pulse at the wrist, at the neck, noting its strength and rhythm. They may extract a small amount of blood, letting it settle in a vessel, studying how it separates. They examine your hair. Has it thinned or coarsened? They look at your eyes. Do they have a particular glassiness, a certain fixed quality? These examinations were not mere theater. Recent paleopathological studies, the archaeological analysis of skeletal remains from medieval leper houses reveal that the vast majority of individuals buried in leprosarium cemeteries did indeed have advanced cases of what we now call Hansen's disease. Medieval physicians, working without microscopes or modern diagnostic tools, were nonetheless remarkably accurate in identifying true leprosy. But they were working with imperfect knowledge. The bacterium Mycobacterium leprae, the actual cause of leprosy, would not be discovered until 1873, when Norwegian physician Gerhard Armauer Hansen identified it, making it the first bacterium proven to cause disease in humans. Medieval physicians had no concept of bacteria, of infection, of microorganisms. They saw only symptoms and sought to explain them through the lens of humoral imbalance. Leprosy, in the medieval medical understanding, was primarily attributed to an excess of black bile. This made a certain intuitive sense within the humoral framework. Black bile was the coldest and driest of the humors, associated with earth, with autumn, with melancholy and decay. Leprosy manifested as a kind of slow drying out of the flesh, a progressive withering. The skin became discolored, thickened, roughened. Extremities lost sensation and eventually tissue, as if the vital moisture of life was gradually withdrawing. Different forms of leprosy were explained by different humoral imbalances. If black bile dominated, but was mixed with excess blood, the result might be a more inflamed, red presentation. If black bile combined with phlegm, the disease might manifest as pale, numb patches. The complexity of leprosy's symptoms, and medieval physicians recognized that complexity could be mapped onto various combinations and corruptions of the four humors. This diagnostic flexibility, while it allowed physicians to account for the disease's variability, also meant that conditions which were not true leprosy could be diagnosed as such. A person with severe psoriasis, with lupus, with certain other chronic skin conditions, might be examined and found to have the signs of humoral imbalance consistent with leprosy. They would then be subjected to the same social death, the same exile, as those with Hansen's disease proper. Yet the medieval physicians were not simply guessing. Their empirical observations, the specific patterns of numbness, the characteristic facial changes, the slow progression captured something real about the disease, even if their theoretical explanation was wrong. They were careful observers working within a flawed paradigm, doing their best with the tools and knowledge available to them. If leprosy arose from humoral imbalance, then the treatment was to restore balance. The most fundamental intervention was dietary modification. Since leprosy was thought to stem from excess black bile, cold and dry, the remedy was to consume foods considered hot and moist. Residents of leprosaria were therefore fed a diet rich in eggs, poultry, pork, fresh milk, and fish. These were expensive, high-quality foods, far better than the grain-heavy, vegetable-dominated diet of most medieval peasants. The logic was medical, but the result was surprisingly nutritious. Leprosaria typically secured fishing rights to nearby rivers or ponds, raised dairy cows, kept pigs and chickens, ensuring their residents had regular access to these therapeutic foods. Fish, in particular, was central. It was considered especially moist and temperate, ideal for counteracting the dryness of black bile. Salmon, pike, perch, trout when available, salted herring and cod when fresh fish was scarce. The weekly rhythms of leprosarium life included the steady consumption of fish, prepared simply, eaten without complaint. The bland taste a small price for the hope, however faint, of improvement. Beyond diet, there were other interventions. Bloodletting was common, the deliberate removal of blood through lancing a vein or applying leeches, with the goal of reducing the overall volume of humors and allowing the body to regenerate a healthier balance. It was uncomfortable, weakening, but accepted as necessary. Cupping involved placing heated glass or metal cups on the skin, creating suction as they cooled, drawing blood and other fluids to the surface. The circular bruises this left were considered signs that corrupt humors were being drawn out. Arab physicians, whose medical texts were translated into Latin and circulated widely in medieval Europe, recommended that leprosy patients spend time in hot and moist environments, bathhouses, warm rooms, anywhere the atmosphere could counteract the cold dryness of their condition. Bathing was considered therapeutic, and some leprosaria had facilities for regular bathing, a practice that, quite apart from any humoral logic, likely improved comfort and hygiene. Herbal remedies were prepared ointments and poultices made from plants thought to possess heating and moistening properties. These were applied to skin lesions, bandaged in place, changed daily. Certain herbs were consumed as teas or mixed into food. The pharmacopoeia was extensive, drawn from classical texts, from Islamic medical writings, from local folk traditions. Whether any of these preparations had real medicinal effect is doubtful, but they represented action, hope, the refusal to simply surrender to the disease. Some treatments bordered on the desperate or the magical. Cauterization, burning the skin with hot irons, was occasionally used to treat ulcerated areas, based on ancient Indian medical practices. The pain must have been extraordinary, and any benefit questionable at best. Arab medical experts believed in the therapeutic power of certain gemstones. For leprosy, topaz was recommended, engraved with the image of a ship and worn on the left ring finger as a protective charm. There were stranger treatments still, blending medicine and miracle. Some accounts describe lepers bathing in pools where small fish, what we might now call doctor fish, would nibble at dead skin, a form of crude debridement. This may have provided some relief, removing necrotic tissue, though it was often framed in religious terms, as a miraculous healing rather than a practical intervention. Medicine and religion were inseparable in the medieval worldview. Illness was not merely a physical phenomenon, but a spiritual one, possibly a punishment for sin, possibly a test of faith, possibly a mysterious expression of God's will. Leprosy appeared in the Bible, most prominently in the Old Testament, where it was often associated with ritual impurity or divine displeasure. The book of Leviticus contains detailed instructions for identifying and isolating those with skin diseases. Miriam, sister of Moses, was struck with leprosy as punishment for speaking against her brother. King Uzziah developed leprosy after improperly entering the temple. These stories shaped medieval Christian understanding of the disease. Yet there was also the example of Christ, who touched lepers and healed them, who showed compassion rather than revulsion. The Gospels record multiple instances of Jesus curing lepers, restoring them not just to health, but to community, declaring them clean. This created a tension in medieval attitudes, fear and pity, revulsion and the obligation to care. Some lepers embraced a spiritual interpretation of their condition. They were not being punished, but tested like Job, whose faith remained steadfast despite being covered in sores. Their suffering had meaning, purpose. It was a form of purgatory experienced in life, reducing the time their souls would spend in torment after death. This reframing transformed leprosy from random catastrophe into divine pedagogy, painful but ultimately merciful. Others could not achieve such acceptance. They raged against their fate, or sank into despair, or simply endured without finding meaning. The leprosarium held all types, the pious and the bitter, the resigned and the rebellious. There was no single story, no universal response to the disease that upended lives so completely. Centuries later, archaeologists excavate the cemeteries of medieval leprosaria. The earth yields skeletons, some relatively intact, others fragmentary. Modern scientific techniques, radiocarbon dating, DNA analysis, microscopic examination of bone pathology can tell us things medieval physicians never knew. Leprosy affects bone in characteristic ways. The bacterium Mycobacterium leprae does not attack bone directly, but the nerve damage it causes leads to repeated, unnoticed injuries. Bones in the hands and feet show signs of remodeling, of resorption. The nasal bones may be eroded. The shins sometimes display a distinctive thickening called periostitis, resulting from repeated trauma and secondary infection. When researchers examine skeletons from proven leprosarium sites places where documentary records confirm the institution housed lepers, they find that the majority of individuals buried there show these telltale bone changes. The medieval diagnosis, for all its humoral theory and lack of microscopes, was largely correct. These were indeed people with Hansen's disease. But there are also skeletons without these changes. Individuals who were diagnosed as lepers, but whose bones show no evidence of the disease. Perhaps they had conditions that mimic leprosy's appearance, psoriasis, lupus, other dermatological ailments. Perhaps they were misdiagnosed. Or perhaps they had leprosy, but died before the disease progressed to the point of affecting bone. Modern paleopathology also reveals something else. Leprosy was declining in Europe during the late medieval period. The peak seems to have been in the 12th and 13th centuries, the very period when leprosaria were most numerous. By the 5th-10th century, leprosy was becoming rarer, and many leper houses were repurposed for other charitable functions, or simply closed. Why the disease declined remains uncertain. Several hypotheses exist. Perhaps improved living conditions reduced transmission. Perhaps leprosy and tuberculosis caused by a related bacterium. Mycobacterium tuberculosis offered some cross-immunity, and as tuberculosis became more prevalent, leprosy found fewer susceptible hosts. Perhaps the aggressive segregation of lepers in institutions actually worked as a public health measure, breaking chains of transmission. Perhaps genetic factors played a role, with European populations developing resistance over generations. The truth is likely some combination of factors, complex and interrelated in ways we may never fully untangle. What is clear is that the disease that so terrified medieval society, that justified the construction of hundreds of leprosaria across Europe, gradually faded, becoming rare in the very regions where it had once been endemic. There is something both impressive and tragic in the medieval medical response to leprosy. Impressive because physicians worked carefully and systematically within their theoretical framework, observing, diagnosing, treating with as much skill as their paradigm allowed. Tragic because the paradigm was fundamentally wrong, and no amount of careful observation of humors and complexions could lead them to the actual cause. A bacterium, invisible to the naked eye, transmitted through prolonged close contact, affecting peripheral nerves in ways that had nothing to do with black bile or cold dryness. The treatments they prescribed, the modified diets, the herbal remedies, the bloodletting ranged from ineffective to actively harmful. And yet, paradoxically, the care that leprosaria provided likely improved outcomes in some ways. The nutritious diet, the shelter, the relative stability, the access to bathing and clean bandages, these basic provisions justified by humoral theory may have helped residents live longer and more comfortably than they would have as destitute beggars on the roads. Medicine is always operating with incomplete knowledge, always building theories that seem complete until they are overturned by new observations, new technologies, new paradigms. Medieval humoral medicine was not stupid or primitive. It was sophisticated and internally consistent. It was simply wrong in its fundamental assumptions about how the body worked. We who live in an age of molecular biology and antibiotics might feel superior, but we too are working with incomplete knowledge. The medicine of 2025 will likely seem quaint, perhaps even misguided, to physicians in 2525. The march of knowledge is not steady, but lurching, full of false starts and paradigm shifts, guided as much by accident and stubbornness as by clear-eyed reason. Return for a moment to the experience of being diagnosed. You stand before the physicians, their faces grave as they consult among themselves in Latin. They have examined your urine, your pulse, your skin. They have pricked you with needles and observed your lack of reaction. They have reached a conclusion. The word falls like a stone: leprosy. In that moment, your humoral imbalance becomes your identity. You are no longer John the carpenter or Agnes the weaver. You are a leper, an imbalance of black bile, a body in corrupted disequilibrium. The diagnosis is framed in medical language, but its consequences are entirely social. You will be separated. You will undergo the ritual of social death. You will enter the leprosarium, where you will eat moist foods and submit to cupping and bloodletting and herbal treatments, all in the hope of restoring a balance that, in truth, was never the problem. You will live out your years within walls, your body slowly changing in ways you cannot control. Physicians unable to help, despite their learning and their texts and their careful theories. The humors remain stubbornly out of balance. The black bile refuses to yield. The disease progresses, indifferent to dietary modifications and cautery and prayers. In the end, you are buried in the leprosarium cemetery, another anonymous grave among dozens or hundreds. Centuries later, an archaeologist's trowel will carefully expose your bones. Laboratory analysis will confirm what your body tried to tell the medieval physicians, but lacked the language to express. This was never about bile or phlegm or the dryness of earth. This was Mycobacterium leprae, a bacterium that could have been treated in another age with a course of antibiotics. But you did not live in that age. You lived in an age of humors and prayers, of careful diagnosis within a flawed framework, of compassionate care that could not cure. And that, too, is part of the long story of human suffering and human efforts, however inadequate, to understand and ease it. As the medieval period waned and gave way to the Renaissance, to the Enlightenment, to modernity, humoral theory gradually lost its hold. New observations did not fit. New theories emerged. The four humors faded from medicine into metaphor. We still speak of being in a bad humor, of melancholy temperaments, of sanguine dispositions, linguistic fossils from a discarded paradigm. But in the leprosaria of the 12th and 13th centuries, humoral theory was living truth. It structured the day, what you ate, when you were bled, how your condition was understood. It gave your suffering a place in the cosmic order, connected your withered hand to the movement of seasons and the balance of elements. Whether this was comfort or cold consolation depended, perhaps, on temperament. Some found meaning in the structure. Others found only the inadequacy of explanations that did not match experience. The night outside the leprosarium is deep and still. Inside, in the dormitory, bodies rest in narrow beds. Some sleep soundly, exhausted by the day's labor. Others lie awake, aware of every ache, every numb patch, every sign of the disease's slow advance. In the morning, there will be prayers and porridge, work in the garden, perhaps a visit from the physician with his vials and his leeches. The rhythm will continue, day after day, until it doesn't, until one morning a bed is empty, and the community gathers for another burial, another soul commended to God's mercy. But for now, there is only the darkness, and the slow breathing of the afflicted, and the infinite patience required to endure what cannot be changed. Let that patience extend to you as well. Let the details of humors and diagnoses drift away. Let the medieval world, with all its careful theories and persistent mysteries, recede into the gentle fog of approaching sleep. Rest now. There is one more story to tell, but it can wait. Everything can wait. The past is patient, and so is the night. We arrive now at our final destination, a place where all the threads of our story converge: suffering and care, faith and violence, the medieval impulse to both heal and conquer. We enter the great hospital of St. John in Jerusalem, run by the Knights Hospitaller, an institution that embodied the profound contradictions of the crusading age. Picture yourself standing in the Christian quarter of Jerusalem in the year 1170, during the relatively stable middle decades of the Crusader kingdom. The city hums with the mixture of languages: French, Italian, Arabic, Armenian, Greek. The streets are narrow, shadowed, thick with the smell of cooking fires and animals, and humanity pressed close together. You make your way through winding lanes to a vast complex of buildings clustered near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is the Hospital of St. John the Baptist, the headquarters and primary facility of the Knights Hospitaller. The complex covers an enormous area, vaulted halls stretching hundreds of feet, multiple wings and departments, courtyards, chapels, dormitories, storerooms, workshops. The hospital could accommodate up to 2,000 patients at its height, making it one of the largest medical facilities in the medieval world. Patients came from everywhere: Christian pilgrims who had fallen ill on the journey, local residents of Jerusalem regardless of faith, wounded soldiers from the constant border skirmishes, the chronically sick, the elderly, abandoned infants. The hospitalers treated everyone. Muslims and Jews received care alongside Christians. Jewish patients were given kosher food, their dietary restrictions carefully observed. This universality of care was remarkable for the age, a genuine expression of Christian charity It transcended the religious divisions tearing at the Holy Land. The origins of the Knights Hospitaller lay not in warfare, but in simple acts of mercy. In the 11th century, merchants from the Italian city of Amalfi obtained permission from the Egyptian Fatimid Caliph to establish a monastery in Jerusalem near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The monastery, dedicated to Saint Mary of the Latins and staffed by Benedictine monks, served as a rest stop for the steady trickle of Christian pilgrims making the long, dangerous journey to the Holy Land. As the number of pilgrims increased, the monks established 2 hospitals in the late 1060s, one for men and one for women. The hospital for men became known as the Hospital of St. John, honoring John the Baptist. It was more hospice than what we would recognize as a hospital, a place of comfort and care rather than aggressive medical intervention, though physicians and surgeons were employed. Then came the First Crusade. In 1099, the Crusader army captured Jerusalem in a storm of violence that left the streets choked with the dead. The hospital survived. Its head, a monk named Gerard, welcomed the Crusaders and their wounded. The new Christian rulers of Jerusalem lavished donations on the Hospital of St. John lands, rents, privileges. Gerard organized these resources into a formal religious order, the Hospitallers, dedicated to caring for the poor and sick. Gerard died in 1120. His successor, Raymond Dupuy, faced a new reality. The Crusader states were under constant military pressure. Muslim forces sought to reclaim lost territories. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, a narrow strip of coastal cities and inland fortresses, required constant defense. Raymond made a momentous decision. The Hospitallers would not only care for the sick, they would also fight. Sometime before 1136, Raymond authorized Hospitallers to take up arms to defend the kingdom or to besiege pagan cities. The order acquired castles, recruited knights, trained soldiers. Without losing its charitable character, the Hospital of St. John became a military order, warrior monks bound by religious vows yet skilled in combat. The Knights Hospitaller organized themselves into 3 distinct classes, each with different roles and responsibilities. The military brothers were knights, men of noble birth, who had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet who rode to war in armor, bearing swords and lances. They wore the distinctive habit of the order, initially a black mantle with a white 8-pointed cross, later changed to red surcoats for battle to allow freer movement. These were the warriors, the defenders, the ones who manned the great castles like Crac-des Chevaliers and Margate that dominated the Syrian frontier. The brothers infirmarian were the nurses and medical staff, often drawn from the sergeant-class men of non-noble origin, who nonetheless dedicated their lives to the order's service. They staffed the hospital wards, changed bandages, fed patients, administered medicines, provided the constant, unglamorous labor that kept the institution functioning. The great officer in charge of the entire hospital operation, called simply the Hospitaller, was always a knight, but the day-to-day nursing fell to these brothers infirmarian. The brothers chaplain handled the spiritual needs of the order and its patients saying Mass, hearing confessions, administering last rites, maintaining the rhythm of prayer that structured each day. Religion and medicine were inseparable. Bodies were tended, but so were souls. This threefold structure created a peculiar organization, part monastery, part hospital, part army. A knight of St. John might spend 1 month in the wards of the Jerusalem hospital, tending to pilgrims with dysentery, and the next month riding with a military column to relieve a besieged fortress. The contradiction was built into the institution's DNA. Imagine yourself as a patient in the hospital of St. John, a pilgrim who has fallen gravely ill with fever, shortly after arriving in Jerusalem. You are carried through the main gates on a stretcher, too weak to walk. The porters who bear you move through a large courtyard and into one of the great vaulted halls that serve as patient wards. The hall is enormous, the ceiling high and arched, supported by thick columns. Light filters through windows set in the walls. The air is surprisingly fresh. The hospitalers understood, in their practical medieval way, that ventilation mattered, that stale air contributed to illness. Along the walls are rows of beds, each with clean linens, a pillow, a blanket. This is not the crowded, filthy squalor that characterized many medieval spaces. This is organized, maintained, intentional. You are placed in a bed. A brother infirmarian approaches, his manner calm and practiced. He asks questions. When did the fever begin? Do you have pain? Can you eat? He feels your forehead, notes the heat radiating from your skin. He brings you water, helps you drink. Later, a physician will examine you, consulting texts and observing your symptoms, attempting to diagnose your condition within the framework of humoral medicine. The hospital is divided into different wings and departments organized according to patients' illnesses and conditions. Those with fevers are separated from those with wounds. Women are housed in a different section from men. The infectious, or those suspected of being infectious, are isolated. This organization reflects an empirical understanding that certain diseases spread through proximity, even if the underlying mechanisms remain mysterious. Meals are brought regularly. The food is plain but nourishing bread, vegetables, fish, or meat when available, wine diluted with water. The hospitalers took seriously the obligation to feed their patients well. The order statute specified that patients should be served meals on individual plates, a mark of dignity and care. You eat what you can manage, the brother assisting you when weakness makes even lifting a spoon difficult. Medicines are administered, herbal preparations, tonics, perhaps a purgative if the physician believes your humors are badly out of balance. None of these will cure you if you have a serious bacterial infection or viral disease, but some may ease symptoms. Willow bark tea, containing what we now know as a precursor to aspirin, might reduce fever and pain. Other remedies are useless or actively harmful, but they are given with genuine intent to heal. The brothers pray over you. The chaplain brings the Eucharist, offering the comfort of sacrament. If you are conscious and able, you confess your sins, receive absolution. If you are delirious or unconscious, the prayers are said regardless, surrounding you with the rhythms of faith even when you cannot participate. Some patients recover. The fever breaks, strength gradually returns, and after days or weeks, you are discharged, given provisions for your onward journey or your return home. Other patients do not recover. They die in these beds, surrounded not by family, but by strangers who nonetheless offer the dignity of clean sheets and prayer. The bodies are carried to the hospital cemetery, given proper burial, their souls commended to God's mercy. The logistics of running a hospital for 2,000 patients were staggering. Vast quantities of supplies were required: food, firewood, linens, medicines, lamp oil, water. The hospitalers owned extensive properties across Europe and the Levant, estates that generated income and produced to support the Jerusalem hospital and the order's other facilities. Mills ground grain. Bakeries produced thousands of loaves daily. Livestock were slaughtered. Fish were purchased from markets or caught in hospital or owned fisheries. Vegetables came from gardens and farms. Wine arrived in great casks. The hospital consumed resources at an astonishing rate, and the order's sophisticated administrative apparatus worked constantly to ensure supplies continued flowing. Water was crucial, especially in Jerusalem's climate. The hospital had cisterns, wells, and arrangements with the city's water suppliers. Clean water for drinking, for washing patients, for cooking. The hospitalers understood, through observation if not scientific theory, that hygiene mattered. Linens had to be washed constantly. Laundries operated, staffed by servants and lay workers, scrubbing sheets and bandages, hanging them to dry in the sun. When a patient soiled their bed, fresh linens were brought. This was labor-intensive, unglamorous work, essential to maintaining standards of care. The hospital also functioned as an orphanage. Abandoned infants common in a city beset by war, poverty, and disease were taken in, nursed, raised. Many of these orphans, when they came of age, joined the Hospitallers themselves, entering the order as brothers or servants, perpetuating the institution that had saved their lives. Yet for all its humanitarian work, the order was also a formidable military force. By the mid-12th century, the Knights Hospitaller fielded hundreds of knights and thousands of supporting troops. They garrisoned massive castles in the frontier regions, strongholds that controlled strategic routes and provided refuges for Christian populations during Muslim raids. Crack des Chevaliers in Syria, perhaps the most famous Hospitaller castle, was a nearly impregnable fortress perched on a volcanic outcrop, its concentric walls and towers bristling with defensive features. The knights stationed there lived a life that alternated between monastic routine prayer, communal meals, study, and brutal military reality patrols, skirmishes, the occasional major siege. When the call came, Hospitaller knights rode to war. They fought at the Battle of Arsuf alongside Richard the Lionheart. They were present at the disastrous Battle of Hattin in 1187, where Saladin destroyed the Crusader field army. They participated in raids and sieges and the endless low-intensity conflict that characterized the Crusader states. The order developed a reputation for discipline and martial prowess. On the battlefield, Hospitallers were recognizable by their distinctive white crosses on black or red backgrounds. They fought in tight formations, heavily armored, trained to coordinate charges and to hold defensive positions. They were respected and feared by Muslim opponents, who understood that Hospitaller knights could be counted on to fight with ferocity and skill. This created a profound tension. The same brothers who gently tended fever patients in the Jerusalem hospital could, weeks later, be cutting down enemies on a battlefield. The same order that took in abandoned infants and fed the poor also participated in the massacre of prisoners and the brutal realities of medieval warfare. How did they reconcile this? How did a brother reconcile changing a patient's bandages one day and slitting an enemy's throat the next? The medieval mind, perhaps, found this less contradictory than we might. Charity and violence existed in separate, divinely ordained spheres. Caring for the sick was Christian duty, commanded by Christ's example and teachings. Fighting to defend Christendom from its enemies was equally a duty, a holy obligation, sanctioned by popes and justified by theology. The Hospitallers saw no fundamental conflict. They were serving God in both activities, in the hospital through mercy, on the battlefield through righteous violence. The Order's rule, the document governing its members' conduct, laid out detailed regulations for both activities with equal seriousness. Yet the tension was real, even if unacknowledged. The Order attracted different types of men, some drawn primarily to the nursing mission, others to the military glory. Some brothers spent most of their careers in hospital service, while others were perpetually on campaign. The institution held both impulses in uneasy balance. As the Crusader states weakened and eventually fell, the balance shifted. After the loss of Acre in 1291, the Knights Hospitaller relocated to Cyprus, then to Rhodes, and finally to Malta, becoming increasingly focused on naval warfare against Ottoman Turkish expansion. The great hospital tradition continued. The Sacred Infirmary in Malta, completed in 1574, could accommodate 500 patients and was renowned as one of the finest hospitals in the world, with schools of anatomy, surgery, and pharmacy. But the Order's primary identity became military rather than medical. Today, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, as it is now known, exists as a Catholic lay religious order headquartered in Rome. It no longer maintains armies or fights wars. Instead, it has returned to its original mission, providing medical aid and humanitarian assistance globally. The Order operates hospitals, clinics, and relief programs in over 120 countries, employs more than 52,000 medical personnel, and distributes tens of millions of dollars in medical aid annually. The warrior monks have become simply healers, the military element stripped away, leaving only the care that was always the order's founding purpose. Step back now. Consider the arc from a small hospice run by Italian monks in 11th century Jerusalem to a vast military medical order controlling castles and estates across 2 continents, to a modern humanitarian organization delivering medicine in war zones and disaster areas. Nearly 1,000 years of continuous existence, adapting, transforming, yet maintaining some core thread of identity. The Knights, Hospitaller, embodied the medieval world's complexity, its capacity for both profound compassion and terrible violence, its interweaving of faith and pragmatism, its ability to build institutions that endured across centuries. The order was never purely one thing. It was contradiction made manifest, healing and harming, protecting and destroying, praying and fighting. Perhaps that contradiction is, in the end, simply a reflection of humanity itself. We are capable of tenderness and cruelty, often in the same breath, sometimes by the same hand. The medieval world did not hide this tension, but built it into institutions, gave it structure, allowed it to coexist within the same vows, the same robes, the same lives. In the Jerusalem hospital, a brother gently lifts a cup to a patient's lips, helping them drink. Miles away, another brother of the same order rides in a cavalry charge, sword raised. Both believe they are serving God. Both are doing what their age demands of them. The water is cool and clean. The sword is sharp and swift. The world turns indifferent, containing multitudes. The night has deepened around us. We have traveled together through strange territories, the stone walls of the leprosarium, where the living were declared dead but found community in exile. The sun-scorched fields of the Crusades, where Richard and Saladin waged war over a city neither could truly possess. The theoretical world of humoral medicine, where black bile explained suffering that was actually caused by bacteria invisible to the naked eye. And finally, the vaulted halls of the Hospital of St. John, where warrior monks embodied the paradox of medieval Christendom, healing and harming in equal measure. These are not comfortable stories. They speak of isolation and disfigurement, of massacres and failed campaigns, of medical theories that could not cure, of institutions built on contradiction. Yet they are human stories, marked by the same impulses that drive us still, the desire to understand suffering, to ease pain when possible, to find meaning in hardship, to build structures that outlast individual lives. The people we have encountered tonight, the leper, ringing their bell on a dusty road, the crusader knight sweltering in armor under the Mediterranean sun, the physician earnestly studying urine samples and consulting ancient texts, the hospitaller brother tending a fevered pilgrim's bedside, all are gone now, centuries dissolved. Their bones rest in forgotten graves, their names erased or reduced entries in crumbling documents. Yet they lived, they struggled, they endured what had to be endured, and sometimes they found grace in small things. A shared meal, a kind word, the rhythm of bells marking the hours, the warmth of sun after cold rain. The medieval world was harsher than ours in most material ways. Life was shorter, more painful, more precarious. Death came easily and often. But it was also a world where suffering was acknowledged, where institutions arose to care for the outcast, where the obligation to the sick and poor was written into the very structure of society, however imperfectly honored. We, safe in our modern age of antibiotics and anesthesia, of heated homes and abundant food, can afford to look back with something between horror and gratitude. Horror at what people endured, gratitude that we are spared such trials. But perhaps also a certain humility, recognizing that the medieval physicians were doing the best they could with what they knew, that the Crusaders believed genuinely in the righteousness of their cause, that the lepers in their stone houses found ways to live with dignity despite everything arrayed against them. History is not a story of progress from darkness to light, though it can feel that way. It is a story of humans trying, across vastly different circumstances, to make sense of existence, to care for one another when they could, to survive. Some of their solutions seem barbaric to us. Some of their beliefs seem absurd. But they were not stupid or cruel by nature. They were simply people operating within the constraints of their time, doing what seemed necessary, or right, or simply possible. As you lie here now, in your comfortable bed, in your warm room, your body free of leprosy and dysentery, and the 100 other plagues that haunted medieval lives, let yourself feel the contrast. You are so fortunate, so safe. The past is the past, its sufferings concluded, its struggles over. Let the images from tonight fade the leprosarium garden in summer, the crusader batters at Acre, the physician's vial of urine, held to candlelight, the hospital ward with its rows of beds. Let them blur and dissolve like scenes glimpsed from a moving train, receding into distance and darkness. You are here. You are whole. The night is gentle. Tomorrow will arrive in its own time, with its own concerns, but that is hours away. For now, there is only this moment, breath moving slow and deep, body sinking into rest, mind releasing its hold on waking thought. The medieval world sleeps beneath layers of earth and time. The bells have long since stopped ringing. The prayers have been said. The stories have been told. And you, having listened, having traveled these strange roads, can at last let go and drift into the quiet, formless peace of sleep. Rest now. Rest well. The past is patient. The night is kind. And all the old sorrows, for this moment at least, are far away.